Our next speaker is doing double duty today because he is also the current LCSNA president. So he will be giving a brief State of the Union, LCSNA State of the Union, before giving us his presentation, which is called Alice in Motion, which is just like a brief history of Alice films. I mean, it's really brief because we could go on for days and days, right? How many adaptations have there been? And Arnold, I'm going to actually read this to give you a proper introduction because it is a mouthful. He is Vice Provost and Lindseth Family University Librarian Emeritus of Case Western Reserve University. And he also is a collector who speaks and writes about illustrated editions of Lewis Carroll's Alice's Adventures in Wonderland and Through the Looking Glass, as I'm sure a lot of you know. So let's welcome President Arnold Hirshon.
And now we're going to move on to the star of our show, Alice, and her adventures in movies and on television. The first theatrical productions of Alice occurred in Carroll's lifetime and with his encouragement. Since then, there have been countless new scripts and new productions. I compiled a list of 63 Alice-related movies and 52 television shows, total of 115 productions. And I'm going to share some statistics based upon that. And I put them into two broad categories. If the work was at least somewhat true to the text, I counted it as being relatively faithful to the original. If it used some element of Alice as an iconic reference point, but otherwise had little else to do with the text, I counted it for this purpose as either an appropriation or an adaptation, which I'll basically use the term appropriation hereafter. These two categories are not absolute. I could easily argue myself into reassigning a work from one category to the other, but for now, this is where they lie. So some quick caveats about these statistics. First, I was not able to access or view every one of those 115 works. When I couldn't view it, I used the best and often very limited information to try and describe each work. Second, the categorizations may seem arbitrary, but I followed Humpty Dumpty's precedents, and what the word's going to mean what I say it means. Third, I only counted films directly related to the Alice books, so I've excluded other Carroll works, such as that wonderful film of the Snark that we just saw, or video biographies that only have short recitations of scenes from the Alice books. Fourth, I do not claim that this list is complete. Consider these numbers preliminary and it's research in progress. And I invite people to, I will gladly send you my list. You can send me an email, I'll send you my list, and you can tell me everything that I missed. And finally, in addition to scholarly resources, I benefited from generally reliable popular information sources. So a great tip of the hat to IMDb, Wikipedia, and YouTube. So here are those statistics. First of all, as you can see, 56% of the 115 films and TV shows were judged to be relatively faithful to the text. 43% were largely appropriations. We know from the number of languages into which Alice text was translated and the number of countries from which the illustrated editions have emerged that Alice has been very popular worldwide for a very long time. So thus far, there are at least 19 countries from which either movies or television programs and miniseries have appeared. Of course, the number of works produced by each country is not evenly distributed. In fact, rather, when looking at the works that are faithful to the text or appropriations, the US and UK account for about 2/3 of the total output, and then the other countries follow in much, much smaller numbers, very often just one per country. Since the first film versions of Alice 120 years ago in 1903, the frequency of movies and TV shows were at least somewhat faithful to the text largely peaked in the 1970s, with a proportional temporary comeback in the 1990s. The first made-for-television programs based on Alice appeared in 1950. In the 1980s, and then beginning again in the 2000s, Alice became more of an icon than a character, and I don't know why everybody is now seems to be seeing every one of my screens. Is that what everybody is seeing?
Yes, Arnold, I was just about to unceremoniously.
Thank you.
Yeah, there we go. Perfect.
Okay. I'm not sure what happened or why. So the first made-for-television programs in the 1950s, in the 80s, and beginning again in the 2000s, Alice became more of an icon than a character, and Alice movies and videos were more predominant appropriations than they were in works that were faithful to the text. And Alice's ubiquity seems to be growing. We're only 3 years into the 2020s, and there have already been more appropriations than in any previous decade, and the number of works faithful to the text is certainly looking to be very competitive. Finally, although on film there's a fairly even distribution between productions that were faithful to the text versus appropriations, while on TV, 2/3 of the were faithful to the text. However, part of this is historic. In the most recent decades, the appropriations continued to increase in frequency. So before we look at some films, I want to talk about some things that we should not consider when we evaluate movies or TV shows that are about Alice. First, I think we should not compare the film to the text. Even Carroll recognized the inherent difference between text, illustrations, and theater, and the advantages of each to tell a story. The books contain very little description about how characters looked, what appeared in the background, etc., which gave illustrators and then early theatrical producers freedom to visualize new things. Theater could deploy actors, directors, costumes, sets, and special effects to bring the scenes literally to life. Film opened up even more possibilities. So if we judge the film solely on the adherence to the original text, we strip away much of the opportunity for creativity. And so we should judge the film on its success in telling a story within its own milieu. And I think that the discussion that they just had with Mark and Simon really helps to illustrate the brilliance of not sticking closely to the text, but still using the text as an inspiration. Second, the earliest films from 120 years, that was the same year that the Wright brothers flew their first airplane. We should consider the quality of the film within the context of its time. What did the airplane look like today versus what it looked like 120 years ago? Well, a film that we look at today from 120 years ago is going to look quaint, but consider how difficult it might have been to produce the effects that it has in its own time. Finally, with illustrated editions, Tenniel's legacy casts a long and perhaps an even unfortunate shadow. Only 3 Alice-related films were issued before John Tenniel died in 1916, but most major film adaptations of Alice draw on his illustrations for at least some of the visual elements. This familiarity can be both a blessing and a curse. Much like skeuomorphs in product design, this may help us transition and make connections between the old and the new by using Tenniel. And so using Tenniel as a skeuomorph may help the audience acclimate to a scene. However, it limits the creativity not only of the filmmakers, but also the imagination of the audience watching the film. Finally, most film-based films and TV shows freely combine the characters from Wonderland with other Looking Glass characters, and the order of the characters' appearance often gets rearranged with little regard to what made the 2 stories significantly different, because they were actually telling different versions of a different story. As Thomas Leach observes, in many films, the characters are held together, quote, only by the abiding presence of Alice, whose role is scarcely more well-defined than that of a television MC. In such cases, the result is more faithful to the series of drawings Tenniel produced for the 2 books than it is to the separate structures of the 2 books that Carroll worked out for them. So, before we start watching some movies, there are a couple of limitations for which I will apologize in advance. First, I'm using clips from a variety of sources that had their own recorded sound levels that unfortunately I cannot adjust on playback. So I hope you can sufficiently adjust your computer's sound level if you can't hear something. Second, some video clips may be choppy. This is sometimes in the original source material, but it could also be affected by either the speed of my internet connection or yours. Some of the choppiness may smooth out over time, but as with the sound, please don't inquire about this in the Zoom chat or the Q&A boxes, because unfortunately I just can't do much about it. So As we start to think about entering the screening room, I apologize if I don't mention one of your favorite films or shows, but with 115 to get through, I can't get through all of them, and I won't even try. There are some I'll only briefly mention, some I may acknowledge but not show a video clip. The clip lengths also going to vary greatly in their length, and in sometimes I will compress or edit them down from the original to try and fit them into a certain time frame. I did not select just the best of the films or the television shows. I purposely picked some that are awful, some that are sublime, and you will also find on each slide the name of on them. That name is usually that of the director. Sometimes it's somebody else, but it's almost always the director, because when all the films have the same title of Alice in Wonderland, you need to be able to distinguish them. I also give a country of origin for places when it's other than the United States or outside the UK. So on to the first film. The first Alice film appeared in 1903 as a British silent film with studio secretary Mabel Clark starring as Alice and Cecil Hepworth as the co-star, cinematographer, and co-director with Percy Stowe. Cecil Hepworth's wife also played a couple of roles. With a running time of 12 minutes, this was the longest British film produced to date, but it was still considered to be too long for an audience, so the film got broken up into smaller scene-sized chunks for distribution. The director's insistence on remaining faithful to Tenniel resulted in lavish costumes and sets for the time, but it blew the budget. The film is memorable for its use of special effects, such as Alice's shrinking in the hall of many doors, and in her large size being stuck inside the White Rabbit's home and reaching through a window. I will show 3 selections from this, all very brief: the opening, a bit of the royal procession, and a part of the Off with Her Head sequence. And I have purposely omitted any underlying sound because it was issued without sound. Moving on. The next film was a 10-minute short silent film from the Edison Manufacturing Company, directed by the seminal early silent film director Edwin S. Porter, who had earlier directed The Great Train Robbery. As a silent film, what little of Carroll's nonsense prose that appears is presented on the title cards. This was also a one-reel picture, which limited the length and required the elimination of most of Carroll's memorable characters from the book. What was used in the film is thought to be faithful in spirit to Carroll and the Tenniel illustrations. At the time, Variety compared the film favorably to the, quote, foreign film fantasies that were then flooding American movie theaters. Okay. In 1915, the costumes and the effects for production start evolving a little bit more in complexity. The lack of sound tends to give this version somewhat the look of a horror film. Both the direction and the acting by Viola Savoy as Alice plod along. As Chris Scott Edwards observed, the set seemed less of Wonderland than my aunt's backyard garden, and the costumes range from the broadly cartoonish to early punch-like caricatures to the photorealistic, such as the Komodo dragon that slithers convincingly over rocks near Alice's feet. Edwards found the White Rabbit to be the most disturbing and creepy looking, but he says it might also be the best thing about this otherwise uninspired film. Finally, Edwards notes that some standard parts of the book are missing, such as the Mad Hatter, who makes an appearance late in the film, but not at his tea party. The clip we see starts with the walrus and the carpenter, then the lobsters join for the quadrille, looking very much like a 1950s Ed Wood sci-fi horror movie. And I think we can agree that the quadrille we saw in the Hunting in the Snark movie was a whole lot better than that. I do want to point out that this film was the first one to have an aftermarket tie-in published book with the text of both books illustrated with still photos from this film that included this color frontispiece. In 1923, Walt Disney gets into the act. He said, "No story in English literature has intrigued me more. As soon as I possibly could, I acquired the film rights to do it." He began with a short comedy with a live child in a world of animated characters, and 56 more, quote, Alice comedies followed and were distributed as laugh-o-gram cartoons. Alice was played by Virginia Davis, and she's a chuck full of curiosity and pays her first visit to a cartoon studio to watch them make some funnies, such as a cat and dog boxing. And then Alice comes and sees in her animated dreams, there appear in live action all of the characters. In this brief scene, lions break out of the zoo and chase Alice until she jumps off a cliff and awakens back in bed. The cartoon had a working title of Alice in Slumberland. It never had a commercial theatrical release, but instead was used by Disney to promote his films to prospective film distributors. Not quite a rabbit hole. So This film by Walter Lang was the first one to reference Looking Glass rather than Wonderland. It was a pre-sound version, and unfortunately, thus far, I've been unable to locate a copy to present, but I'm going to keep looking. This short film, which starred Joan Bennett, was a segment within a full-length feature film called Puttin' on the Reds. After that film's release, a section that included the Alice in Wonderland part was extracted and new title cards were added to turn it into a standalone 6-minute short to be used in theaters and later on television. It was originally filmed in 2-strip Technicolor, but unfortunately that print is now lost. The underscored song was written by Irving Berlin, one of 3 songs that he wrote entitled Alice in Wonderland, the first one of which was for the Ziegfeld Follies. For the one on this version, he largely lifted the tune from the American folk song, I'm Gonna Leave Old Texas Now.
Know the tale of the girl who was sitting by the fire with her kitten. It's a story that was written long ago. Come along with Anna into Wonderland, to the lovely palace where they're all so grand. Come take a peep at the queer-looking duchess with the rabbit in her clutches, which is just about as much as he can stand. There's Tweedledum, Tweedledee, hear them prattle all about a broken rattle. Tweedledee has got a battle on his hands. Look here, you can see the walrus, and there's a carpenter by his side. Look there, how the little oyster, and Humpty Dumpty who'll fall down from the wall. That isn't all. You'll be delighted with the high-hatted man called the Mad Little Hatter. Never mind about his chatter, cause it really doesn't matter, but it's grand.
Before I proceed, I want to check, Heather, is the sound coming through on, I want to make sure I check the right box. For,
Yes, yeah, we're hearing the first one was the Disney one, which was rather jarring, but yeah, we're hearing it.
All right, good, thank you. So Alice fever started gripping the nation as the celebration of Lewis Carroll's 100th birthday in 1932 approached. Now, this particular film by Bud Pollard was a low-budget, black and white, American-made film, but it was the first version in which some of Carroll's original dialogue could actually be heard. The film opens up with Irving Berlin's third and forgettable Alice song, again with a below-par lyrics. About this film, the New York Times said, notwithstanding the drawbacks of poor photography and none too efficient vocal recording, there are times when the scenes look as though Sir John Tenniel's illustrations had staggered to life, armed with Carroll's pleasingly imaginative lines. Yet much more might have been done with the camera, for aside from 1 or 2 double exposures and some wobbly flashes of Alice getting shorter and shorter or taller and taller, things run along a little too smoothly. The film was not financially successful and it received little critical attention, and today it's rarely, if ever, shown, but here's a clip.
What is your name, child? Answer.
My name is Alice, so please your majesty.
And are you not afraid to come here without a royal invitation? Speak.
Since you're only a pack of cards, after all, I needn't be afraid, need I?
Off with her head. Off with it, I say.
Well, you can't cut off my head, but I can cut you like any other pack of cards.
I don't think I'd want to run into that Alice in a darkened movie theater. So the first really major production is this 1933 Paramount film that drew heavily from the then recent stage adaptation by Ava Le Gallienne and Florida Freebus. Originally issued at 90 minutes, it was cut down to 76 minutes for general release, and that was even still thought to be too long. To try to save itself from bankruptcy, Paramount threw virtually everyone in its stable of stars into the movie, including Cary Grant, Gary Cooper, and W.C. Fields. Bing Crosby, however, refused to play the Mock Turtle because he felt it would be demeaning to his career. Sterling Holloway played the Frog, and he, of course, was later the voice of the Cheshire Cat in the 1951 Disney animated version. After screening more than 7,000 applicants over a period of 5 months, Charlotte Henry was chosen to star as Alice, beating out the likes of Ida Lupino, Betty Grable, and Paulette Goddard. The only animated sequence in the film is part of the Walrus and Carpenter scene, and it was created by the Leon Schlesinger Studios, which also produced Betty Boop and Popeye cartoons. So here's a portion of that.
What shall I repeat to her?
The Walrus and the Carpenter is the longest.
The sun was shining on the sea, shining with all his might. He did his very best to make the billows smooth and bright. And this was odd because it was the middle of the night. The Walrus and the Carpenter were walking close at hand. They wept like anything to see such quantities of sand. If this were only cleared away, they said it would be grand. If 7 maids with 7 mops swept it for half a year, do you suppose the Walrus said that they could get it clear?
I doubt it, said the Carpenter, and shed a bitter tear.
So despite the stars and the cutting edge special effects, this was a notable box office flop, and it cast doubt on whether any live action Alice could be successfully presented on screen. The heavy makeup and the costumes made even these top ranked stars totally unrecognizable, despite the fact that in the film's opening, they had shots of each star with and without makeup. Contemporary critics largely savaged the film, but Alice Little Hargraves herself said she was delighted with the film. And I am now convinced that only through the medium of the talking picture art could this delicious fantasy be faithfully interpreted. More recent evaluations of the film are somewhat kinder and appreciative of its special effects. Dave Kerr notes that as dazzling as today's digital effects can be, we remain all too aware of how they are accomplished, and they lack the seductive sense of mystification that this film achieved using practical techniques derived from Victorian stage magic. Yet regarding the characters' makeup, he said, it's still profoundly creepy, with some characters that seem less lovable as eccentrics than as recent escapees from Scorsese's Shutter Island and capable of unspeakable acts. So in 1934, Betty Boop got into the act with Betty in Blunderland, which was produced by the aforementioned Fleischer Studios. Betty falls asleep while doing the jigsaw puzzle. She goes through the looking glass into a modern urban wonderland, and then most of the characters assemble around her, and Betty sings "How Do You Do" to them. Following the sequence that I will show, the Jabberwock steals Betty away, and all the characters come to her rescue.
Everyone, how do you do? The cook in the kitchen and the Duchess too. The dormouse and the teapot and the man had it too. How do you do? Ooh.
Ooh. Walt Disney thought about producing an Alice film, not just the cartoons, as early as 1931, starring Mary Pickford as Alice. And he was going to do it as a combination of live and full animated feature-length film. He shelved the plans after the 1931 Bud Pollard sound film was issued, followed by the 1933 Paramount version. He thought it best to wait until the latter one was totally forgotten, and it convinced him that live action versions should never have been made in the first place. In 1939, Disney asked David Hall to prepare some storyboards for an animated film with the creatures modeled on Tenniel. Hall's images veered between funny and frightening. A provisional soundtrack was recorded, but Disney had some reservations about the entire production, so he just let it sit. He tried to do a film again in 1941, but World War II prevented its production. After David Hall died in 1964 at age 58, his illustrations sat in the Disney archives until they were discovered again in 1976. And in 1986, his stunning pictures were published in a book for all of us to enjoy, but there are no video portions of that. There's much to say about the splendid Lou Boonen stop-action animated version of Alice, particularly the fascinating, if disturbing, backstory about how the seemingly avuncular Uncle Walt wielded his power in Hollywood to ruthlessly sabotage Boonen film virtually out of existence. However, I'm going to leave that fascinating story to Jenna West's introduction later today and the screening of the film. You certainly won't want to miss that film. So the impending release of Disney's animated Alice brought a flurry of productions on television that were essentially extended ads for the movie. For example, before the film was even finished, there was a 1 hour in Wonderland broadcast on Christmas Day in 1950. The 18-minute show included an appearance by Walt and a less than 1 minute excerpt of the film's Tea Party scene in vivid black and white. Also jumping on the Alice bandwagon, but with a non-Disney production, was a Ford Theater Hour production, but TV production notable because of the young and as yet undiscovered Jack Lemmon starred as Tweedledum. And then 4 months before the Disney film was released, the popular CBS Fred Waring show gave an elaborate presentation of the musical score. Appearing live were Catherine Beaumont as Alice, she was the voice in the Disney film, and also appearing live on the show was Sterling Holloway as the Cheshire Cat. Fred Waring used his own chorus of singers, his Pennsylvanians, to sing the other parts. The show was clearly an ad for the Disney movie. It premiered most of the score for the film. Many Alice characters are thrown in with elaborate scenes and lines reappropriated freely from one character to another. This half-hour TV show was perhaps the first televised musical recreation of a film. To give his official seal of approval, the show featured a special appearance at the opening by Walt Disney, as well as a clip from the film. And then there were reenactments by Fred Waring and his Pennsylvanians. Let's watch a 1 minute excerpt starting with Uncle Walt's introduction, followed by a couple of songs.
It's always a challenge bringing a great story classic to the screen, giving visual form to characters and places that have only existed in the imagination. But it's the kind of challenge we enjoy.
'Twas brillig and the sliding toves did gyre and gimble in the wave. All mimsy were the Borogoves and the mom rat outgrave.
A very merry birthday to you.
To me.
To you. A very merry birthday to you. To you. It's great to drink to someone, and I guess that you will do. A very merry birthday to you. A very merry birthday to us. To us. A very merry birthday to us. To us.
If there are no objections, let it be unanimous. A very merry birthday to us.
So the Disney film with animations based upon storyboard illustrations by Mary Blair moved away from Tenniel's sketchy illustrations and took a modernist stance with bold colors. There was a script that was focusing on comedy, music, and the whimsical side of the books. Released with huge fanfare, the film disappointed not only critics, but audiences. Disney himself felt it failed because the character of Alice had no heart. The film never had a theatrical re-release in Walt's lifetime. It did regain a second life in 1954 when it aired in the severely edited version as the second episode of Disneyland's TV series on ABC. Following the success of the '68 film Yellow Submarine, and 17 years after its initial release, Disney Studios reissued Alice, and it became a drug culture hit film classic, favored among college students, so much so that they put it back into the theaters for the first time in 1974, promoting it as a film in tune with the psychedelic times. While it's generally better regarded today than when it was first released, Leach notes that Disney seemed to subvert Carroll's belief in childhood innocence, confidence, and adventurousness. Since this version is so well known, I've decided not to show a clip from it, but rather a short clip of a song that was actually cut from the film. The film was going to include all of Jabberwocky as a song, but Disney felt that the scene could become too scary or too long. So the studio retained only that 'twas brillig opening verse that we saw Sterling Holloway just sing. However, by giving that song to the Cheshire Cat, they had to drop the Cat's original song called I'm Odd. The music was found years later in the Disney archives, and the studio assembled an animated montage, including illustrations from the David Hall, storyboards, and clips from the 1951 film to show what might have been had the song been included. Here's the first chorus of the song.
My head begins to jingle most every time I nod, 'cause obviously, quite obviously, I'm odd. Each Christmas I go fishing to catch a Christmas cod, 'cause obviously, quite obviously, I'm odd. When I was just a kitten, they said I'd be a gem, but now that I'm a Cheshire Cat, it's odd how odd I am. I own a feather pillow, but I slumber on the sod, 'cause obviously, quite obviously, I'm odd.
So moving on. Originally transmitted in the Hallmark Hall of Fame series, this low-budget production was mounted on a stage set. It was broadcast in color, but the only extant recordings are in black and white. As was true of most productions that used the source script, male actors were often cast in female roles as the Duchess, the Cook, and the Queen of Hearts, which makes them particularly relevant today in the context of controversies over exposing children to performances by drag queens. This was a generally faithful but abridged version of the 1930s, with the brilliant Eva Le Gallienne playing the White Queen. Even a very brief clip of her speaking with Alice demonstrates her extraordinary acting abilities.
Well, it's very good, Jam.
Well, I don't want any today at any rate.
Well, you couldn't have it today if you did want it. The rule is jam tomorrow and jam yesterday, but never jam today.
Well, it must come sometimes to jam today.
No, it can't. It's jam every other day. Today isn't any other day, you know.
I don't understand you. It's triply confusing.
Oh, that's the effect of living backward. Always makes one a little giddy at first.
So this clip that I'm about to show you is from a movie called Storm Center. In it, a small town librarian played by Betty Davis befriends Kevin, a young boy who's interested in reading, but his father is only interested in sports. When the librarian refuses to remove the controversial book from the shelves, she's branded as a communist, which makes her a cause celeb for the townfolk who want the book removed. Affected by the hysteria in the town and by his father's complaints about the library, for some reason, Kevin sets fire to the town's library. Many books go up in flames. And here's the shortest appearance by Alice on film. In case you're curious, for the bookish among you, that burning copy was published by Grosset and Dunlap with Tenniel illustrations in 1946. Even the Three Stooges managed to drag Alice down the rabbit hole. This cartoon had little to do with Alice, a lot to do with the Stooges. And as visual design, let's just say it's less than complex. And I have the clip, but I'm actually going to skip.
Spot of tea.
So that I can bring you this go to 1966, which brought some of the best and some of the worst Alice's on film. Let's begin with perhaps the most dreadful TV version ever. It featured a score by Adams and Strauss of Bye Bye Birdie fame, and animation by Hanna-Barbera of Flintstones fame. And the cast included such talents as Zsa Zsa Gabor as the Queen of Hearts and Sammy Davis Jr. playing the Cheshire Cat as a groovy, rockin', swinging feline beatnik. We don't have time for the full monstrosity of this title song, but I'm going to give you a taste. And for those who are familiar with the score of Bye Bye Birdie, the tune is pretty much the same as the song One Last Kiss.
What's a nice kid like you doing in a place like this? What's a nice kid like you doing in a place like this? Now I got a hunch you won't like it here. The potato chips are soggy, they water the beer. What's a nice kid like you doing in a place like this? Now you could be in pictures with that cute little face. So how come you hanging around this funky place? What's a nice kid like you doing in a place like this? I'm splitting. Doing in a place like this. I gotta leave. Do it in a place like this.
You couldn't leave fast enough. Here's my nominee for second worst. This NBC television special with a cast that included Jimmy Durante and the Smothers Brothers. Jimmy Durante played, obviously, Humpty Dumpty. The Smothers Brothers were Dum and Dee. Originally broadcast as a pre-Thanksgiving extravaganza, it was broadcast at a time when all the major networks were trying to emulate the success of TV's broadcast of the 1939 film of The Wizard of Oz. As a result, in this version of Alice, they play very fast and loose with the text, providing Alice with an Oz-like road to follow and a new character, Lester the Jester, a direct imitation of the Scarecrow. There were also three witches a la Macbeth, and the Jabberwock makes an appearance before Humpty Dumpty sang his "'Twas Brillig and the Slithy Toads." Performed and videotaped with an annoying canned laughter to simulate a television studio audience, this production is horribly stage-bound and pretty deadly. Here's Jimmy Durante with a little bit of his Humpty Dumpty.
Repeat after me. 'Twas Brillig and the Slithy Toads did Gyra and Gimble.
'Twas Brillig and the Slithy Toves did Gyre and Gimble.
Old Mimsy were the Borogoves and the Moon Rats out grey. Go ahead.
Old Mimsy were the Borogoves and the Mome Rats out grey.
That's right.
'Twas Brillig and the Slithy Toves did Gyre and Gimble.
Sound each syllable triply until your tongue is nimble.
Old Mimsy were the Borogoves. But what is Mimsy?
Half of it is miserable, the other half is flimsy.
Moving on to the best from 1966, Jonathan Miller's of Beyond the Fringe fame wrote and directed the most surreal version of Alice. He used the very best British actors, including John Gielgud, Michael Redgrave, Peter Sellers, Malcolm Muggeridge, and his two fellow cast members from Beyond the Fringe, Peter Cook as the Mad Hatter and Alan Bennett as the Mouse. There's little use of visual effects. For whatever reason, it was shot beautifully in monochrome, but the choice to not film it in color may have also reduced its long-term marketability. The sitar-playing legend, Ravi Shankar, supplied the music. This version of Alice seems to reflect the lingering aesthetic that came to the fore in 3 years earlier with Peter Brook's production of Marat Sade with the Royal Shakespeare Company. In this version of Alice, Alice herself is nearly catatonic, alienated, and a distant visitor, while the other characters seem like the inmates of a Victorian insane asylum. Nonetheless, this stands as one of the most intriguing, idiosyncratic, and important incarnations of Alice on film.
What's a caucus race?
Well, best way to explain it is for us all to do it. Come along, come along.
So I'm going to pause briefly in the chronology just to acknowledge a few other multiple BBC productions that came later, including one in 1973 by James McTaggart, starring Sarah Sutton as Alice, the 86 Barry Letts directed version starring Kate Dorning as Alice, and the 1998 version produced by BBC4 as a movie featuring the young Kate Beckinsale as Alice. The last one is most notable for including the lost chapter from Looking Glass, The Wasp in a Wig, which I believe is the only feature-length film or TV production to date that included that scene. This French TV production will be shown tonight's midnight movie, so I won't say much about it. It's a surreal film very much of its psychedelic times in which Alice descends not just into a world of wonders and eccentrics, but also one of intense color, experimental blue screen TV film, and strong and prolonged strobe sequences. Curious Alice was indeed curiouser and curiouser. It's a perfect example of the law of unintended consequences, an anti-drug film produced by the US Department of Health Education and Welfare and intended oddly for 8 to 10-year-olds, and everything went horribly wrong. It included images that would be perplexing to children, and there was no differentiation between what was good and what was bad. Amadon asks, would the average third grader understand that the sugar cube at the Mad Hatter's Tea Party is laced with LSD? The intended message was severely undercut by visuals that gave children a trippy and daring play of animation, moving sensual environments, collages mixing drawings and photographs in unpredictable angles and points of view, and suggesting a permanent disturbance of gravity and consensual realistic representation.
Keep this under your hat, friend. But she doesn't know what we're doing.
Yes, I do. You live here in this beautiful place. It could be Wonderland, and all you do is take those
pep pills, sleeping pills,
LSD,
marijuana, heroin.
Stop it! Do you know what you're doing?
Well, what are we doing?
What time is it? 6 o'clock. Tea time. Time to take a pill.
No! Why?
Just take a few amphetamines and you can be like me.
Or freak apart your tender brain by taking LSD.
Sleeping pills are beautiful.
Heroin is king.
Everything is clearer now. Just let me do my thing.
You may blow your mind completely, but won't you take the chance?
Will you? Won't you? Will you? Won't you? Won't you join the dance? Will you?
Now, do you know where you are? Go home. It's too late. It's too late.
No! It's not too late.
So, that was one of the stranger ones. The 1972 British version had songs by John Barry, who wrote the James Bond theme, and Don Black wrote the lyrics. This is generally regarded as one of the better Alice movies. A rather mature Fiona Fullerton plays Alice. Some believe some aspects of the production were built on the work of Jonathan Miller 6 years earlier. Personally, I don't agree. His film was much darker and surreal and clearly intended for adults, where this version is clearly a retelling for children. The costuming intentionally referenced Tenniel, leaving only the eyes and the mouth of the characters exposed. The only resemblance to Millard's is the use of many well-known British actors who are in both pieces. Ralph Richardson was here as the caterpillar, Dudley Moore as the dormouse, and Peter Sellers plays the March Hare.
Will you walk a little faster, said a whiting to a snail. There's a porpoise close behind us, and he's treading on my tail. See how eagerly the lobsters and the turtles all advance. They are waiting on the shingle. Will you come and join the dance? Will you, won't you, will you, won't you, will you join the dance? Will you, won't you, will you, won't you join the dance?
Moving on. This Italian TV miniseries starred notable actresses of the 1960s Italian theater. The translation is said to be respectful of the original, even trying to retain the puns and nonsense, albeit with necessary changes. The translator was Natalina Angeli, who produced print edition translations of both Alice books in the same year, perhaps as an aftermarket tie-in to the TV series. The film included some changes to the original text, such as giving Alice's sister a name, Susanna, and by having Alice in the Pool of Tears recite not a translation of How Doth the Little Crocodile, but rather created a wrong version of an Italian poem by Luigi Sailer called Vispa Teresa. While there's no recitation or mention of the mouse's tail, that's also true of nearly every other filmed Alice. This version was live action, low budget, Fellini-esque from Argentina, when the country had no movie industry and independent films were made by young people on budgets they could afford. Most scenes included very limited dialogue, and they were played against a background score in the style of the period. The costumes were usually minimal, with one of Humpty Dumpty shown here being one of the more elaborate costumes. In the film, Alice is a pure-minded library worker who, as an adult, begins to fantasize about reliving her life. A white bunny taps her on the shoulder. She follows him through the streets, parks, and beaches of Buenos Aires, including crashing a parade. When she enters Wonderland, excited animals and people expose her to creativity and pleasure. And in this quick clip, the Cheshire Cat holds a mask, displays some sexually suggestive overtones, and even if you don't speak Spanish, you can probably figure out what the cat is discussing with Alice.
¿Qué clase de gente vive por aquí?
En esa dirección vive un sombrerero. Y en esa dirección vive una liebre de marzo. Visita a quien prefieras. Ambos están locos.
Ah, pero yo no quiero estar entre gente loca.
No puedes evitar eso. Todos estamos locos aquí. Yo estoy loco. Tú estás loca.
¿Cómo sabe que yo estoy loca?
Tienes que estarlo. ¿O no habrías venido aquí?
So there's an X-rated musical version of Alice. This is decidedly not for children. It was played by Playboy centerfold Christine DeBelle as a repressed, virginal, and yet another small-town librarian who discovers her sexuality when she starts reading Alice. The movie was a huge hit on the pornography circuit, and it made over $90 million worldwide. Not surprisingly, I could not find even a very short sequence suitable for showing, but you can certainly buy this on Amazon if you're really interested. In 1981, Elizabeth Swados composed a musical, Alice in Concert, that was then put on PBS TV in the US called Alice at the Palace. It starred a young Meryl Streep at age 29, dressed in a long white blouse and pink overalls. Cast also included Mark Lynn Baker, Michael Jeter, and Debbie Allen. When it was recorded for PBS, Streep got to perform such songs as Eating Mushrooms. There was also a Greek chorus, Watching from Above, and slide projections for special effects. The sequence I excerpted for here is Alice in the Croquet Garden. Meryl Streep shows her already well-developed talent for vocal mimicry, here singing in the style of Joan Baez.
Never play croquet with a ball that's a hedgehog, cause the hedgehog will run away. Never hit a hedgehog with the beak of a flamingo, cause that's not how to play croquet. You'll be stuck with your book in the mug, and you'll be stuck, you know. You'll be stuck with your book in the mug, and you'll be stuck.
I see lots of hedgehogs running. I see lots of flamingos sunning themselves in this tropical air. It isn't fair. And you'll be stuck with your bug in the mug, and you'll be stuck.
I don't think they play it all fairly.
So we have some representation from outside the English language, another one. 2 Russian DVD releases of this animated film using cutout forms. It was produced in the Ukraine during the Soviet Union days. Both of these films employ somewhat bleak color palettes, and the animation style resembles high-level anime. There's also an electronic soundtrack that's reflective of the period, but I am not going to show a clip of this one. This production by the Minneapolis Children's Theater Company was directed by John Clark Donahue and aired on PBS in the United States. He was the co-founder of the company and its artistic director for 2 decades. It has some interesting artistic touches, but the show itself was overshadowed by a couple of years later when in 1984, he had to resign from the company in disgrace because he had to plead guilty to sexually abusing 3 boys. He was sentenced to 10 months in prison and his artistic legacy was shattered, but the production lives on and it is worth viewing on its own merits. Although you've likely never heard of any of the actors, some of the performances are really quite strong. There was a film version of PBS of the 1982 Broadway revival of the Legalian Phoebus play. Kate Burton played Alice with winsomeness and charm, and her father, Richard, who would only die a few months later, was a poignant white knight. Among the many other notables in the cast was Nathan Lane, very early in his career playing the mouse. Like the 1933 Paramount film, there was heavy makeup, elaborate disguises, use of tenniel designs, but the costume and makeup here did not completely hide the actors' faces. The costume and set design clearly, including the cross-hatching of tenniel, show a lot of influence, but several characters look little or nothing like Tenniel's illustrations, such as Tweedledum and Tweedledee, who are slender and live tap dancers who show off their agility. Some find this production a delight, and one of the best adaptations, others declare it earnest but dull. Perhaps the best scene is Richard Burton singing "A Sittin' on a Gate," from which I extracted an edited clip.
I'll tell thee everything I can, there's little to relate. I saw an aged man a-sitting on a gate. He said, I look for butterflies that sleep among the wheat. I make them into mutton pies and sell them in the street. But I was thinking of a way to feed oneself on batter, and so go on from day to day, getting a little fatter. Or if I drop upon my toe a very heavy weight, I weep, for it reminds me so of that old man I used to know, whose look was mild, whose speech was slow, whose hair was whiter than the snow, whose face was very like a crow, with eyes like cinders all aglow, who seemed distracted with his woe, who rocked his body to and fro, and muttered mumblingly and low, as if his mouth were full of dough, who snorted like a buffalo. That summer evening long ago, sitting on a gate. And now I must be going.
And Arnold, I don't want to disrupt your flow here, but just because you have 4 decades to go, I wanted to make sure you saw you only have 5 minutes left.
Yes, I know, and I'm going
All
to be skipping through quite a number of them very quickly.
All right, sounds good.
This was an anime series from Japan. I don't have any clips from here either, but I want people to be aware how international Alice was. We have a family-friendly version with a huge cast of stars with a score by Steve Allen. Sammy Davis Jr. returned as another hepcat, hookah-smoking caterpillar. Will Brooker says of this version, comparing it to Jonathan Miller's, that the tone is the Muppet Show rather than a Freudian nightmare. And he talks about Telly Savalas in a cat suit that's strange enough, creeping up upon Alice that gives you a bit of unease. This show took a lot of liberties with the text, including the exploding caterpillar and suddenly dancing away. And it uncomfortably looks like a replay of Bill Bojangles Robinson and Shirley Temple dance routines. I'm going to show just the
Try You Are Old Father William and see how that comes out. Do you know that poem?
Of course. Let me see. It starts, you...
Wait. Let me help you.
You are old, Father William,
the young man said, and your hair has become very white.
You get the idea. In 1985 was a UK release from the Anglia television 5-episode 5-episode miniseries adapted from a Norwich Puppet Theater's The Silver Puppet Group production. These adaptations, faithful to the text, retaining all the key characters and scenes. Some of the puppetry may be a bit crude, limited expressions and movements. Scenes are set against very colorful and picturesque photographs and live action using Tenniel illustrations. Dream Child is a particular favorite of mine. It's not an adaptation of the book, but rather an exploration about how Alice as an adult reflected upon her childhood. It's a fictionalized account of Alice Little Hargraves in her 80s and making a real life journey to appear at Columbia University for the 100th anniversary celebration of Carroll's birth. Carl Brown played Alice, Ian Holm, Dodson, and the film includes some wonderful makeup, special effects, and reenactments produced by the Jim Henson Creature Workshop. Although Alice was unafraid of these characters when she was a child, she becomes terrorized by them in her old age as she feels her grip on life and her mind are slipping away. I'm only going to play a very, very short part of this because time is so limited. And I wish I could show more, but I don't have the time. We also have the Care Bears. I'm not going to talk about the Care Bears other than to say that this was a flop. Many of you have already seen the Jan Svankmajer film. Not to everyone's taste, as Heather pointed out before, dark and surreal. Stuffed animals come to life, then they fall apart and their sawdust comes out. And of course, Svankmajer also had books that he produced. Most of the imagery does not come from the film. There was an experimental film shot on location, Alice Underground. No time for that one. No time for this one with a wonderful little scene of the Lobster Quadrille being sung by Gene Wilder, perhaps some other time.
You've never...
There's Alice's Misadventures in Wonderland, which we can also skip, an indie film that tried to follow Carroll's intentions, but didn't do it very successfully. We had this sci-fi version of Alice that I could not get through the first time, so I purposely wouldn't have included a clip with it anyway. We have, of course, the Tim Burton versions that April is going to be speaking about very soon, so I'm going to skip past it, as well as the 26th Looking Glass directed by James Bobbin. And I leave you with this trivia question. Besides Kate Beckinsale, which actresses who played Alice in the movies had a major acting career thereafter? And with it, I thank you for your patience, and back to you, Heather.
Well, you got to give us the answer. You're just going to leave it like that? Or is it just hypothetical because none of them did?
Oh, no. You can be thinking about it, and maybe later I'll reveal the answer. If anybody wants the answer, you send me your guesses in email and I'll let you know what the answer is.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Arnold. I know that that's a daunting task to try to squish that much history into one talk. So we definitely appreciate you doing that for us.